The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Sophie sat cross-legged on the scuffed hardwood floor, surrounded by canvases leaning against cracked white walls. The afternoon sun slipped through a narrow window, casting slanted shadows across her paint-stained jeans. A cold breeze seeped in from the window frame, but she barely noticed. Her hands moved instinctively, a brush dancing across a half-finished canvas, lost in the rhythm of layering colors, until the buzz of her phone shattered the silence. She glanced at the screen, expecting a gallery notification, maybe an update from Harrison. But instead, it was Marcus. Marcus, her older brother, the family's success story. The golden child who always had the last word and made sure everyone heard it. She hesitated, then unlocked the screen. One message. Sold your amateur paintings for $50 each. You're welcome. Sophie froze. At first, she didn't understand. Her mind refused to process the words. Sold? Paintings? $50 each? Her eyes scanned the message again and again. Then it hit her like a slow, cold wave. Marcus had gone through their mom's garage. He'd found the old portfolio she left behind years ago. 5 canvases, unframed, stored during a time when she couldn't even afford decent brushes. A time when she painted not for prestige, but survival. He had sold them at a garage sale for $50 each? Sophie stared at the message. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled slightly. Not from anger, not yet. From shock. On the tiny screen of her phone, a smug emoji grinned at her, like a punchline to a private joke. But the real joke? Each of those 5 paintings was worth approximately $12 million on the open market. Not to collectors, not to strangers, but to the very people who had bought them, her own gallery. The very same dealers Sophie had worked with for years under a pseudonym known only to a tight circle of the art world elite, M. Sterling. That name had never once been spoken inside her family's house. Her own father didn't even know she was still painting professionally. Her mother passed before the truth could be shared. And Marcus? He thought he'd done her a favor. He had no idea that he'd just sold a collective fortune for the price of a dinner tab. No idea that the work he labeled amateur was being studied in graduate-level art courses. No idea that his sister, the failure of the family, was a ghostly icon in the contemporary art world. Sophie's thumb hovered over the keyboard. What was there to say? Should she scream, laugh, break something? She typed a reply. Simple, controlled. Thanks for letting me know. She hit send, then sat in silence. The coffee in her mug was cold now. But inside, something far colder had begun to settle. Not rage, not even sadness, just the deep, hollow knowing that once again, the people closest to her saw only what they expected, and not what was truly there. Sophie didn't scream. She didn't call him. She didn't throw her phone across the room, even though she could have. Instead, she just sat there, still, silent, as if the silence itself could cushion the blow of what had just happened. A part of her knew, deep down, that reacting would be useless. Marcus wouldn't understand. Not really. He would say something dismissive. Or worse, he would laugh. Because to him, they were just old canvases collecting dust in a garage. To him, she was still the little sister who couldn't make a living from painting. But to Sophie, those 5 pieces weren't just art. They were memories. They were pain. They were the nights she cried herself to sleep over a half-finished sketch. They were the mornings she woke up hungry, but still found a way to paint through the emptiness. Each stroke, each layer, each texture was a piece of her soul pressed into canvas. And now, gone, sold for less than the price of a pair of shoes. Her chest tightened, but her face stayed still. Because this wasn't the first time she'd felt invisible, but it might have been the first time it hurt this deeply. He didn't just sell 5 paintings, she thought. He sold 50 months of my life and called it decluttering. And as that truth settled in, Sophie whispered silently to herself, he just sold my soul, and he'll never even know what he touched. Was it betrayal, or was it a favor? That was the question burning in Sophie's mind as she sat there, frozen, surrounded by paint silence and a phone screen that still glowed with Marcus's smug little message. "You're welcome," he'd said, as if he'd rescued her from her own mediocrity. The truth, he hadn't just touched something valuable, he had touched a secret that Sophie had guarded with ruthless precision for 4 years. She wasn't just Sophie Chin the girl her family pitied, the so-called starving artist living in a shoebox apartment with secondhand furniture. She was M. Sterling, the reclusive, anonymous painter whose haunting works had become the heartbeat of contemporary art. No interviews, no photos, no public appearances, just the work. And the myth. Her pieces had sold in whispers and bidding wars passed between collectors like sacred relics. Museums competed for her work. Critics studied her brushstrokes like scripture. And her name, a letter, a ghost, a mystery. Her real life and her public legend existed on 2 separate planets, and she had done everything in her power to keep it that way. Why? Because Sophie knew exactly how fragile it all was. The second her family found out who she really was, what she really was, the illusion would collapse. And so she let them believe the lie, that she was broke, that she was struggling, that her dreams had failed. Because as long as they believed she was small, they wouldn't look close enough to see how enormous she'd become. To the world, Sophie Chin lived like she was barely holding on. Her apartment was a cramped 3rd-floor walk-up on the outskirts of the city, with peeling paint and a radiator that coughed instead of heating. The kitchen tiles were chipped. The couch sagged. Her bed creaked with every breath of wind. Anyone who stepped inside would have thought, she's trying, but barely surviving. And that's exactly what she wanted them to think. Because this place, this tiny apartment, was never her real home. It was camouflage, a carefully crafted decoy. Her real studio, her real life, sat 5 miles away behind a chain-link fence and an unmarked steel door in the city's forgotten industrial district. From the outside, it looked like nothing, just another abandoned warehouse. But inside, it was cathedral-sized creativity, 5,000 square feet of freedom. Skylights cut into the high ceilings bathed the space in natural light. Industrial easels towered over the polished concrete floor. Giant canvases, some as tall as 12 feet, leaned against stark white walls like sleeping giants. The air smelled of oil paint and ambition. In that space, Sophie wasn't the struggling artist anymore. She was M. Sterling every inch of her. Here, no one pitied her, no one questioned her, no one asked if she was still doing that painting thing. In this sacred space, her vision breathed, her soul expanded, her silence thundered across canvas. And no one from her family even knew it existed. Every time Marcus sent a condescending text, every time her father offered job openings at call centers, Sophie would return to this place, open the skylight, and smile. They didn't see it, and that was the point. Because what they couldn't see, they couldn't destroy. They meant well. That was the cruelest part. They didn't mock her out of malice. They weren't trying to hurt her. No, they just never believed in her. And somehow that hurt worse. Every month or so, Marcus would forward job listings to her inbox. Entry-level admin work, he'd write. Steady hours, decent benefits, just until you figure things out. Their dad wasn't any better. He once printed out an entire career guide for creative types who need a real job. "You've always had a good phone voice," he said proudly. "A receptionist role would be a smart first step." Sophie would nod, smile politely, pretend to be grateful. Because it was easier than explaining the truth, that her paintings were being sold at auction for more than most people's retirement funds. And Marcus, oh, Marcus had opinions. After the garage sale, he called again. "Honestly, Sophie," he said with that familiar tone, the one dipped in condescension but wrapped in concern, "I think you're too close to your own work to be objective." He chuckled. "I mean, come on, $50 each isn't bad. For amateur stuff, you should be thankful." Thankful. For what? For having her soul sold like yard trash. For having her life's work appraised by someone who thought abstract meant unfinished. She bit her tongue. Because in their eyes, Sophie was still the girl with too much potential and not enough direction. Still the art girl chasing dreams in the clouds. Not the artist whose signature no one could recognize, but whose work no gallery could afford to ignore. They didn't see her, but they loved her, and that made it worse. There's a strange kind of grief in hiding your greatness, not because you're ashamed of it, but because you know. The people closest to you will never understand it. That was Sophie's life, a life where every triumph had to be swallowed quietly so no one around her would feel small. Her success wasn't a celebration, it was a secret. While critics compared her work to Basquiat and Rothko, her own father still thought she didn't have a real job. While collectors from Paris, Tokyo, and Dubai competed for her next piece, her brother Marcus still suggested she work reception at a dental office. She had earned the kind of respect most artists spent decades chasing. But to the people who raised her, she was still that kid who draws stuff. And that cut deeper than any rejection the art world ever threw at her. Because in the gallery world, at least, they saw her work, studied it, paid for it, respected it. But at home, they didn't even see her. And worse, whenever she tried to share a small win, a little piece of light, she was met with blank stares, tight smiles, and that loaded phrase, "That's nice, honey, but have you thought about something more stable?" Yes, she had. That's why she built a $1 million career from scratch. That's why her signature was worth more than their house. But saying that out loud, that would have sounded like arrogance. So instead, she stayed quiet. And with every success she kept hidden, with every accolade she couldn't share, the distance between her and her family grew just a little wider. Until one day, they weren't just in different places. They were on different planets. They weren't just paintings. Each one of those 5 canvases sold at that garage sale was a chapter of Sophie's survival. They were from her Meridian series, a body of work she created during the darkest, loneliest, and most uncertain time in her life. Back when she had no name in the art world, no gallery, no recognition, just the aching need to express something, anything, before she broke. One piece, Meridian, was painted after a night she spent sleeping on the floor because her mattress had been sold to cover rent. She had cried that night, not for attention, but because she genuinely didn't know if she'd still be in that apartment the next week. She poured it all onto the canvas, a mess of chaos and streaks of raw red, a storm frozen in pigment. But to Sophie, it wasn't chaos, it was truth. Another painting was done in total silence over 3 days of no food. She ran out of groceries and refused to ask anyone for help. Her hands trembled while she painted. She nearly passed out on day 2, but she kept going because creating something, even in hunger, made her feel alive. She remembered dozing off at 3 a.m., with her face pressed against the drying paint. The texture of that canvas still lived in her memory, like a scar she never wanted to heal. These weren't just early works. They were her therapy, her diary, her battle scars in color. And now some stranger at a garage sale had haggled them down to $50. They didn't just buy art. They walked away holding pieces of Sophie's soul, pieces she hadn't been ready to lose. Sophie already knew the answer. The moment Marcus mentioned some art dealer from the city who was really nice and left his business card just in case, she knew. It was Harrison Mitchell, director of Mitchell & Associates, one of the most respected galleries in the country. The man who had built her name, well, her pseudonym, into a legend. M. Sterling didn't just appear in the art world overnight. Harrison had orchestrated every move, every release, every whisper. And when she told him years ago, "If my early works ever surface, get them back, quietly, no headlines," he listened. That's who bought them. That's who handed Marcus $50 bills with a smile. Not because he was stealing, but because he was protecting her story, her mystery, her worth. He knew what those 5 pieces really were, the roots of a revolution. So while Marcus patted himself on the back for clearing out the garage, Harrison had already secured the paintings and placed them in climate-controlled storage, waiting for the day they'd anchor a retrospective that could define art history. And Sophie? She didn't stop him, because in a world that rarely understands artists while they're alive, sometimes you need someone who believes in the story you're still writing. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when Sophie didn't hide her paintings, a time when she still believed her family might be proud of her. She remembered one night vividly. She was 19, had just finished her first oil painting that didn't look like a school project. She brought it downstairs, beaming, hands still smudged with paint. "I think this one's good," she said. Her father barely looked up from his newspaper. Marcus mumbled, "It's kinda messy." Her mother was silent for a few seconds and then asked, "Is that supposed to be a tree or a person?" That night, Sophie took the painting back to her room and flipped it to face the wall. It stayed there for 6 years. And from that moment on, she stopped asking for approval. She learned that in her family, art was a phase. Praise was rare. And silence meant you're not good enough. Now, years later, the world saw her differently. Professors dissected her brushwork. Galleries fought over her exhibitions. Museum curators whispered her name with reverence. But her father still sent her links to job postings. Her brother still believed she was struggling. The world saw a genius. Her family saw a disappointment. And that was the sharpest kind of heartbreak. Because Sophie wasn't asking to be worshipped. She didn't need applause every day. She just wanted to be seen, just once, by the people who raised her. But they never looked, not really. And now, the gap between them wasn't made of failure. It was made of misunderstanding, and it was wide as a canyon. It was a Saturday, the kind where everything feels too quiet. Sophie had barely taken off her coat when she realized something was off. The living room was unusually tidy. A fresh pot of coffee on the table, 2 manila folders placed perfectly beside matching mugs. Her father gestured to the couch with a kind smile, the kind people use when they're about to say something they know you won't like. Marcus was already seated back straight like he was preparing for a presentation. "We've been thinking," her dad began, "about your future." Sophie didn't interrupt. She listened. Folder 1, job listings in customer service and clerical work. Folder 2, brochures from certification programs, accounting, real estate, medical billing. "You're still young," Marcus added. "You've got time to pivot." Pivot? Like this was a failed startup and not her life. "You're clearly creative," their dad chimed in. "But it's time to get serious about stability." Sophie said nothing. She nodded, smiled, took a sip of coffee. And not once did they ask how her art was going. Not once did they mention her actual passion. Because in their eyes, art was something you grew out of, like imaginary friends or teenage crushes. And this intervention, it wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was kind. And it didn't see her at all. They were worried about her making $30,000 a year. Sophie had just sold a painting for $14.2 million. Let that sink in. While her dad was circling job ads in the local paper, her agent was wiring funds from a silent auction in Geneva. While Marcus talked about financial stability, Sophie had received a handwritten letter from the Med inviting her to headline their fall exhibition. And they thought she was lost. They had no idea. Her inbox wasn't filled with job alerts. It was full of private collectors, museum curators, and Forbes journalists. She had to pretend she was broke, so they wouldn't ask questions. She wore worn-out jeans, not because she couldn't afford new ones, but because success was safest when it looked like failure. If they knew what her life really looked like, they'd either faint or ruin it. So Sophie nodded through their advice. She smiled through their concern, and she said nothing. Because if she told them the truth, if she said, "I just sold a single painting for $14.2 million," they wouldn't believe her. They would think she was lying, or delusional, or worse, arrogant. That's the curse of being invisible too long. When you finally shine, they call it a trick of the light. Sophie closed her eyes. One polite smile, two nods, and now silence. But inside her head, a different kind of conversation was playing. "I want to apply to the Art Institute." She remembered saying that when she was 17. Her dad didn't shout. He laughed and said one word, "stupid." Not unrealistic, not risky, just stupid. That night, she cried into her pillow, quietly, so no one would hear the sound of belief breaking. She painted in secret after that, always after everyone went to sleep. One morning, her mom walked in and saw her sketching by the window. For one breathless moment, Sophie hoped. Maybe this time she'd say, "That's beautiful, honey." But instead, her mom glanced at the table and said, "At least you wiped it down this time." That was the only praise she'd ever gotten. Not for a painting, not for talent, but for cleaning. And yet they wondered why she never shared her art. Why would she, when the only applause she ever heard at home was for being invisible? "It's time," Harrison said. His voice was calm, but Sophie felt the quake in her bones. The studio was still thick with varnish and silence, and the words hung in the air like lightning about to strike. A full retrospective, M. Sterling, 10 years of mystery, one historic night. The idea was bold, beautiful, dangerous. Her gallery wanted to go big, a private showing in Manhattan. Then a touring exhibition across Europe, all under one name. A name that was hers, but not the one her family knew. Sophie stared at the canvases around her. Each one was a scream she had painted in silence. What if they saw? What if her brother walked past a piece and said, "Wait a second, this looks like..." Her whole identity, so carefully hidden behind 4 years of secrets, could unravel in 4 seconds of recognition. And yet, something in her wanted it. Was this fear or freedom knocking? The question kept her up that night, and the only answer she had was this: if they find out who I am, then maybe it's finally time they do. Harrison leaned forward. "We'll need a name." Sophie didn't blink. "You already have it," she said. "M. Sterling." Silence. Harrison raised an eyebrow. No reveal, no signature, not even a silhouette on opening night. Sophie's voice was calm, but steel. No press, no cameras, no name change, just the art. Harrison sighed. "You do know this could change your life." "Exactly," she whispered. That's what she feared. Being seen. Not just her work, but her. The girl once told she was stupid for dreaming. The woman now holding multi-million-dollar canvases in her bare hands wasn't ready to give herself to the world. Not yet. Because the moment she did, she could never take it back. This wasn't just a gallery show. It was a wire walk over everything she'd built without a net. She chose the shadows. Again, not because she was weak, but because silence had once saved her life. And letting go of that silence felt like tearing open old wounds. So for now, the world would see the masterpiece, but not the master. The sun hadn't yet risen, but Sophie was already in the studio, barefoot, silent, deliberate. She stood before a blank canvas, larger than any she had touched in years. A single signature brush rested beside her palette. And this time, she wasn't reaching for M. Sterling. She was going to write her real name, Sophie Chin. Her heart pounded like a war drum. Not out of fear, but because this was it. The lie was over. The hiding was done. The real artist was stepping forward. Later that morning, Harrison walked in holding coffee and stopped cold. "What is that?" he asked, eyes locked on the bottom corner of the canvas. Sophie didn't look up. Her voice was steady. "It's me," she said. "All of me, for the first time." Harrison's face went pale. "Do you realize what this means? The press, the family, the fallout?" Sophie nodded. "It means I'm done being invisible." It started with a whisper, then a blog post, then 5 news alerts in less than an hour. Confirmed. The anonymous artist M. Sterling is Sophie Chin, the failed daughter. Art critics were speechless. Collectors scrambled. Museums began rewriting plaques that very day. Her name, once ignored at the family dinner table, now lit up CNN, the New York Times, Vogue, and even the Louvre's Twitter account. Hashtag Sophie Chin trended globally within 90 minutes. A single headline captured it all: the greatest artistic unmasking of the century. And then came the real twist. Photos of Sophie next to her paintings surfaced from security cams and backstage footage. Side-by-sides comparing her brushstrokes to M. Sterling's signature. The internet went wild. Sophie Chin, the quiet, broke, invisible girl, was the genius behind a $400 million empire of silence, color, and pain. The art world gasped. But her family, they were still frozen in disbelief. The house was silent. Not the kind of silence you sit in, the kind that hurts. Marcus sat at the dining table, pale fingers trembling around a glass of untouched water. Their father stood by the window, eyes locked on nothing. Sophie entered, not with swagger, not with fame, just truth. Marcus's voice cracked. "Who are you?" Sophie met his eyes, calm, tired. "Still your sister," she whispered. Then her father spoke, barely above a breath. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sophie smiled. Not kindly, not bitter either, just hollow. "Because you never asked." The words fell like thunder, but the silence after them, deafening. 4 years of invisibility, 4 years of being told she was less, 4 years of hiding her greatness to survive their indifference. And now they finally saw her, but only after the whole world did. The gallery lights were warm, soft golden. The air buzzed with quiet awe. Critics whispered. Collectors wept. But Sophie didn't look for them. Her eyes were searching only one direction, toward the entrance. And then they came. Her father, her brother, her past. Marcus wore a suit slightly wrinkled, his eyes wide with pride, but also something softer, humility. He shook hands with strangers, pointing at Sophie's portrait. "That's my sister. That's Sophie Chin. M. Sterling." He smiled big. But he never mentioned the garage sale. Never once. And Sophie didn't need him to. Because tonight, no one looked through her. No one told her to be realistic. No one called her invisible. Tonight, they saw her. Fully, proudly, finally. The crowd had thinned. The wine glasses clinked quieter now. Sophie stood near her final painting, the centerpiece of the gallery, a piece called Inheritance. Her father approached slowly, hands clasped, eyes wet. He didn't say much, just stood beside her, staring at the canvas in silence. Then he spoke, voice low, trembling. "I'm sorry for teaching you to be realistic when you were busy creating a whole new reality for the world." Sophie didn't respond. She didn't need to. In that moment, the apology was everything. Not just for the years of dismissal, but for every time she was told to dim her light just to fit their narrow view of the world. She smiled, gently, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen, loved, and free. The lights dimmed. The last visitor left, and Sophie stood alone in the middle of her truth, no longer hiding, no longer waiting for permission to be great. In her journal, she wrote the final line of the night. true worth isn't in being seen. It's in no longer needing to be, just to live true to yourself. She closed the notebook, exhaled slowly, and smiled not for the cameras, not for the praise, but for the little girl who once cried in a garage. That girl finally made it home. Some truths don't need to be validated to be real. They just need you to keep living them out loud. Never let someone else's silence convince you to doubt your own voice. The brightest flames often grow in the dark, waiting for the moment you stop asking for permission to shine. You don't have to be seen to be worthy. Your worth is in how you keep going, keep creating, and keep loving, even when no one is clapping yet. If this story touched you, if you've ever had to dim your light just to fit in, hit that subscribe button right now. We tell stories that make you feel seen, heard, and understood. And hey, drop a comment. What part of Sophie's journey hit you the hardest? Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they matter.